I've got a few slides. There's probably about 15, 20 minutes of me rabbiting on about stuff. But the idea was I did this for a webinar. It was done to cause a discussion around what do people mean by data storytelling and kind of what is best practice and kind of do people talk rubbish about it or not. Now, I've kind of, I just put some of my thoughts down. So I'll try to share the screen. I'm hoping that's going to work.
Agenda items that are scratched off, are they pushed to the next meeting, or would we stand up an interim meeting, or how does that work?
We're hoping to get them. It's just been a perfect storm that Tim was the one that was coordinating the ODI, and I wasn't involved in that. So they may turn up, but I very much doubt it because I've not heard anything. So yeah, we just created this perfect storm where Martin Callingham. There was going to be an interview between me and Martin Callingham about his life to preempt his biography. And then we had a completely full agenda, and then all of a sudden everyone couldn't make it.
It sounds very. I'd certainly be interested in doing it next time if we can't get around to it this time. Sounds interesting.
Oh, everything that we can't do, we will do in the future. It's just as I say, it's not been cancelled; it's been postponed.
Okay.
When Jan mentioned the items, I thought I'm not stepping in and doing my autobiography. That could definitely wait for another day. And I'm not sure who published that.
I did mean Martin Callingham's.
Oh, thank God for that. Yeah. Right. So here we go. Can everybody see the screen?
Yeah.
Right. Starts off with 3 slides, which were because I've just realised I've left 3 slides in the presentation that I only used one of, and I can't remember which is intriguing. So there's almost 3 alternatives for just why is storytelling important. That's an American poet that the quote's from that I've never read anything by her, which is a bit weird, but it's the I like the picture from Krakenori. I want a reading room like that. But the whole importance of stories, depending on the audience, I've either used the slightly posh version of Kipling's words are, of course, the most powerful drug used by mankind. If history were taught in the form of stories, it'd never be forgotten, which is relatively cultural. But I tend to prefer the Tyrion Lannister kind of quote, there's nothing more powerful than a good story. As you'll probably gather through this, I'm a sci-fi and fantasy geek. I do read bits of history stuff as well and all sorts of things, but I'm particularly fond of all things sci-fi, fantasy, and what I keep calling graphic novels, and my wife calls comic books. So everybody's kind of blatched into this. Data storytelling is a good thing. There just seems to be some odd approaches in my head to it. So lots of data storytelling seems to go down this route of everybody now needs to somehow be a Tableau Zen master. I know Tableau have changed the title for that to something that sounds a bit more professional, but I don't think it would actually improve things at all. But I think there's another kind of approach here that if I think of storytellers, my mind goes more to kind of Jim Henson and the old kind of storytellers around a fireplace than anything else. Because I think people concentrate far too much on the data word and not enough on the storytelling. And one of the, I think you can tell that from what's been kind of printed and the amount of stuff. You can tell data storytelling is the hot topic just because of the amount of things that have been printed, whether it's blogs, books, YouTube channels. I took this as a snapshot off the internet. It's not actually my bookshelf, I was going to point out, but then my wife did point out I do own about half of them anyway. But there's a mountain of books being published, but I think they cover a range from the good, the bad, and the indifferent. So the ones I've probably took most umbrage with are kind of things like this, which caused me a degree of confusion. So they're picked at random, but data storytelling in Python, it's part 1 of 2, so presumably there's another part to that. Storytelling with R featuring several digressions, or visual storytelling with D3, which is, as far as I'm aware, some sort of JavaScript language. And I think the problem with all of this is it takes the technical bit, but it's giving people the equivalent of a Roget's Thesaurus and a nice Mac and thinking they're going to be a great author. It's all the technical side of things, but it doesn't really to me, it doesn't really cover storytelling. It just means people have got more tech skills, and they've already got quite a lot of them anyway. Even if I look at some of the books I do like, they to me don't really do the storytelling piece necessarily. So they tend to, a lot of them seem to be in how do you make a better chart or a better graph, which is definitely worth doing and absolutely is great, or how do you write a PowerPoint presentation that's not crap, which is again laudable and is great, but doesn't really necessarily get into storytelling. And where I looked at it with that, I particularly like Cole Nussbaum and Affleck's book. I don't know if that's how you pronounce her name or not, but it is if you're from Bradford. But her book covers, it kind of goes through in stages from how do you set the context and look at what your audience is, and how do you decide what story it is you're trying to tell and what the key parts of that story are. She talks about choosing the right visual for the story. There's some very good chapters about decluttering charts, and actually she's not quite in the Tuft kind of data ratio territory, but it's how do you make things really clear in terms of PowerPoint? How do you use things like pre-attentive attributes to get focus within charts? But then the last chapter is about story. How do you pull that together into a story? So even a very good book that's about 250 pages has 20 pages on actual storytelling, and they're kind of shoved on the end. And this is the bit which I think we kind of miss. And I summed it up as, and again, if Ian was here, I think he might even recognise that, because that's West Bridgford Library in Nottingham. I described the problem as we head straight up the stairs instead of turning left or right. And if you've never been in West Bridgford Library, that means absolutely nothing to you. But the science and maths books, if you like, are straight up the stairs in there. But I would, proper literature, if you like, is off to the right somewhere. And the sci-fi fiction and comic books are off to the left. And I think we don't really look at actually how people tell stories. And we can learn a lot of lessons, I think, from people who are actually storytellers. And when I've mentioned comic books with this, people have definitely, some of the sort of vendors, there was a guy from Tableau who was actually in the webinar, and he was increasingly getting irate, particularly when I said you could learn more from comic books than some of their courses. But I'll talk a bit about, there's a couple of books which I've read. One by a guy called Scott McCloud on understanding comic books, and one by a guy called Will Eisner on graphic storytelling and visual narrative. Eisner, for anybody who doesn't have the same affliction, was one of the early kind of comic book authors back in the stage where Batman and Superman were being created, and now the Eisner Awards are the comic book industry's version of the Oscars. But Eisner said something really interesting. He described what a story was, and he described a story as a vehicle for conveying information in an easily absorbed manner. That's pretty much a definition of data storytelling as well, in kind of my mind. And I think McCloud he tried to do a bit more of a proper definition of a comic book, if you like, and he described comics, ignoring the plural in form used with the singular, ignoring that bit. He called it juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. That's every PowerPoint presentation I've ever tried to write in terms of a data presentation has pretty much been that definition. I write comic books, which actually would be a cooler way to earn a living. And I tried to illustrate it with a few examples of things, just lessons you could kind of learn from this sort of different area that I think I've got more value from than a lot of the technical stuff. So the first one I talked about was South Park and Parker and Stone, guys who write South Park. And there's a 5-minute video on YouTube from a lecture they did at New York Uni. And they talked about how to create an interesting story in South Park. And if I exclude most of the expletives that we're using, they said the problem with a lot of stories where they get to be boring is that people write stories and it's like this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. And they described that as extremely tedious. Well, they didn't quite use the words extremely tedious, but that's what they meant. And what they say is when they get, sorry, pardon, people that do the storyboards for South Park, the connections between the scenes are the words therefore and but. So what they do is basically for every what would be the equivalent of a slide, the connection should be either therefore or but, not then. So it's like this happens, therefore this, therefore this, but this, therefore this. And I've literally used it as a sense check in presentations for does my presentation flow? And it works very well as a kind of storytelling device, again, in data presentations in PowerPoint. The second one I used was a woman called Emma Coates, was a senior storyboard artist for Pixar. And she's written a 22 rules for storytelling in Pixar. It's been around ages. Not all of them are relevant to data, but some of them are. And I've used this with a lot of junior analysts in the team before in terms of just try to train them in presentations. So you've got to keep in mind what's interesting to you as an audience, not what's fun to you as a writer. The amount of presentations young analysts do in particular, which have got great technical detail in, which is wonderfully interesting to an analyst, an absolute death when you present it to a senior audience. But it's a mistake most young analysts still make first up. And I've used this to kind of help bring it to life. And the other one I've talked about is George R.R. Martin. And the story I've kind of told around this was around Christmas reviews. So for every retailer, they may be going slightly out of fashion. The big Christmas review was the set piece presentation and autopsy on Christmas. Mostly all of the board members would turn up, particularly at Boots, along with probably about 50 or 60 of the great and the good in the biggest presentation room you found, and it'd be half a day of a job. And literally, it was a fairly tedious run through of core trading statistics, the customer satisfaction survey, brand index. What did the brand index measure? So you pretty much went through all of the metrics. By the time you'd done 200 slides of PowerPoint over 3 hours, everybody was they were needing another Christmas holiday. It was dreadful. We changed it around one year and it worked really well. So instead of me rabbiting at the front or one of my team for 3 hours, the Game of Thrones books are written from the perspective of different characters. So it's like a character per chapter. So literally you'll have kind of right, John, Bran, Ned. Literally they're written in that way that it's a particular character's story, then flips to another character. We took that approach with the Christmas review. And instead of doing all of one data set at a time, then all of another data set, we did how did Christmas work from the viewpoint of a store manager, from the viewpoint of a brand manager, from the viewpoint of a trader, from the viewpoint of e-commerce. And it interspersed the different metrics into that story. And we got the different people to either present themselves rather than the data team or co-present with the data team. So you got different voices, different aspects. We got great feedback that was a far better way to do it. And as I said, that didn't come out of a Tableau manual. That was some strange thought that struck me watching an episode of Game of Thrones. And I think it's not just books. Similarly, you get a lot of books talk about colour theory and how to design and use colour in charts. It's nearly all from Johannes Itten's colour wheel from Bauhaus. And I've had more from going back and reading a book on Bauhaus art history than some of the kind of data storytelling pieces. See, in terms of the sort of stuff I've been reading, which have given me ideas, I did. Now, technically, I'll claim that I bought Neil Gaiman's masterclass on storytelling because it was interesting for work. In reality, I just bought it because I like Neil Gaiman. Alan Moore, who's written all sorts of comic books. Watchmen, V for Vendetta. I need to behave with my geeky hobby. But his book on comic books. And at the minute, I'm just listening on Audible to Stephen King on writing. And I think if I summed it up, it's Stan Lee said the more you read, the better you're going to become as a storyteller. And I think in terms of telling better stories, actually listening and thinking about how people tell stories is a lot more use than the technical stuff. And I think we've become a bit inundated with advice on how to do the best chart we can using something like Python, rather than actually thinking about the stories themselves. That definitely took me to the end of the bit I've got and that I was doing there, and I now need to stop sharing the screen. So that was the piece I did with an intention of trying to start a discussion. So I don't know whether anybody, do people agree? Do people think I'm insane? Do people wonder what on earth I've been reading? Over to you guys.
So this time I'm certainly going to let Mark speak first.
I like therefore and but. I think it's about. I see the storytelling as kind of leading the person on with whatever they want. You know, we've done this, and this has found this, and then this is then led on to this other thing, and this is why it's interesting. You've got to keep that pace going, otherwise it is death by slides. My experience. You also got to cut craft. There's so much crafting stuff as well. It's sort of like nobody cares how many iterations you did of X, Y, and Z. You just got to cut it down to the bone. You can easily get 20 slides down to 5 and still get the key message across. And actually, it's punchier. You can end up with more discussion about what should we do now rather than how did you do this and what the hell is whatever the algorithm that you've written on there, because everybody just starts glazing over. Definitely chimes with me on the approach. I tend to not use color too much because I'm colorblind, so it makes it quite tricky to actually see what anything's going on in a graph. It has to be quite stark kind of contrast on colors, because you're looking at the hue and saturation. And for me, the worst thing ever is when everything is almost virtually the same saturation. I just can't see anything on it. It's like trying to watch snooker. It's just like, this is a pointless exercise for me.
It's on one of the bits which is one of the bit that Colin Affleck's book talks about a lot, which I've got more and more of my team doing, that everybody seems to have a temptation to just either use the Excel settings for colours or use a different colour per bar or something. And one of the things she says is if it's one bar in a bar chart that you're trying to make stand out because that's the month that's different to something, just grayscale all the others and put a nice vibrant colour on the one that you want people to look at. And we're increasingly doing that. And I think the charts just look way better. And I've got to, I've not particularly thought about would they be easier to read if you're colourblind, but I strongly suspect they would be.
Much easier, much easier. I just realised I didn't have the video on. I do exist as a person. Sorry, I just hadn't twigged it at all.
So, I suppose to start with, it's a delightful validation of my hobby, Martin, which is fantasy and sci-fi audiobooks and novels. So thanks for that. I can now chalk that time up to career development. So that's very good.
It was certainly my excuse for buying the masterclass.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with Mark that the therefore and but thing feels like a really nice, a really communicable sort of hack. Yeah, it's a great thing that I could do with my team in a room to say, what we're going to do is we're going to go through a presentation and discuss what we think is good about it. Like, it's just a really nice way of getting to that, maybe. And then experience would validate your suggestion that I've certainly had situations where I've been pitching something, and probably subconsciously I've known that the way to do that effectively to non-technical stakeholders has been to do user stories and tell a narrative, right? Because I'm trying to sell on something that doesn't exist. It's a hypothetical, so I don't have to, I can tell a pretty granular story, and I can tell a high-level story, and it's easy to follow along. That makes a lot of sense. My only question, or something that I'm going to take some time to mull over, I think, is it feels like there is a risk in the difference between presenting and storytelling, for me, from a sort of novel versus professional presentation perspective, is in a novel, I, the writer, have chosen the conclusion or the destination, what is profound in terms of the story itself. In a professional presentation or as a piece of research analysis or whatever it might be, actually the stakeholders interest in where it should go, or being driven by changing environment or the data, that is sort of the guiding light for the storytelling. And I feel like there's maybe a risk that if you go down the route of this, tell a compelling story, you might end up very well doing that, but ending somewhere slightly different than is most valuable for like a senior stakeholder presentation. I'm sure that that's something that is modifiable with experience and time and good communication and everything else. Nevertheless, it does feel like if you're starting out on that journey and this is something that you're learning how to do, that feels like a bit of a risk to the person producing the presentation, you know.
It was odd when we discussed it before the webinar. Somebody gave we didn't get to a conclusion as to kind of what best practice would look like, but somebody did make a really good point that kind of he almost said you've almost got two different versions. You've got one version where you end the series and absolutely this is the end of it and it's like this and the writers write the last episode, and the other is or do you leave them on a cliffhanger where 2 or 3 different things could have happened in the last frame and kind of leave it to, and then you kind of let the audience kind of almost do the how would you finish this from the sort of cliffhanger. And I thought that was quite a good way of looking at that, because sometimes you're almost not going to finish the story and you're going to kind of have to let people almost do their own kind of what is that last frame then.
Yeah, I certainly think that as an approach, it's hard to argue that this is not the best approach to designing your the style of presentation, right? It's that I think at least my nature would be if I'm trying to do that subconsciously, I'll go right. Here's the start, here's the middle, here's the end, and I'll sort of figure out that end in advance, and then I'll find my way to it. And it just feels like that by itself, you have to keep that in check, because what you're actually, let's say you want to do a cliffhanger thing, right, which feels pretty apt, because a lot of the time we've done some research, here's some insight, what should we do next, right? That's very much fits that. But you've got to be pretty hot on. I'm not tying these off in a way that's, you know, pleasing to the narrative eye. What I'm doing is I'm giving the accurate insight and letting the decision be made. So it just feels like that's something to be conscious of if doing this approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a mull over one as well.
Not everything's always a story. Sometimes it's just about engaging the brain cells of the people you're trying to present to.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It can just be this. You know, some stories don't actually do that. It's just like watching somebody go through the motions of a day. That can also be, but it has to be engaging. You can't just be boring. Just sat there and watch telly all day. That's not going to be interesting. But there can be, you know, stories don't have to have an end in there. It doesn't have to be like that. Sometimes it is the journey, and actually that is also valid to present as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly had the experience before. Well, to be fair, I've used like a user story to get to the conclusion, right? But I've certainly had the experience before where I've been trying to engage with improving a process, and you ask people, what are your pain points, and, you know, what could we improve, or whatever it might be from a data perspective. And I tell you a whole long list of things that are about 2 foot in front of them, and really understanding what their user story is in terms of this is their day in, day out firefighting, solving these problems, dealing with this, blah, 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 blah. But what that's allowed me to do is take a step back and go, well, what if you just rethought the entire process, or, you know, what if this bit was different? And that's super engaging to them, because they're sort of stuck in their own story, and you're saying, okay, forget that for a minute. You know, what about this?
So maybe it's less about storytelling and more about engaging presentations.
Yeah.
I've actually put my 2 penneth in here, because I've actually been published a few times writing stories in magazines years and years ago. And each magazine will have their their own writing style. And they have that writing style because they know who their audience is. And they want their writers to write to that style so they engage their audience. So once you know who your audience is, whether they're technical or non-technical, and if it's a mixture, then you're royally screwed because you've got to really hit the middle road and try and capture both of them. But you've got to know who's reading what you're writing or listening to what you're telling, because then you lose. If otherwise, you lose your audience. And the styles of just magazines, you know, from Hello and all the other, Take a Break, all the ones that have the short stories in them, they all demand different things. Paragraphs have got to be certain lengths. You've got to start from the beginning of the story and have a beginning, a middle, and end. You can't start at the end and then backfill what the story was, because that doesn't fit in with their style. It doesn't fit in with their readership. Other magazines, that's what they want. They want you to start with the end and backfill it. So yeah, know your audience, and then everything should come a lot easier.
I think that's really important. I think a lot of the advertising with a lot of the stuff that I've read has said as well. And that's being brave as well with that, because you're right. The really difficult ones, the ones with a mixed audience. I can remember one of the ones that sticks in my mind, and my team thought I was insane, but it worked. So we had a problem at Boots. We had a promotion on nappies that I've talked about a bit with from an analytical viewpoint. We couldn't figure out where it was working and where it wasn't. It was 3 for 2 because it's what Boots do on everything as a first pass. And what we did was we went and stood, me and the senior analyst, in one of the stores and watched people shopping the fixture, which is generally the way I tell this tale, because it's one of the things I kind of try to advise people and get people to do. And we watched a young mum try to put 3 bags of nappies and get out of the Vic Centre, the Vic Centre in Nottingham onto a bus. And she literally took the kid out of the buggy, put 1 bag of nappies in the buggy, got the kid to carry one, and had one under her own arm. We kind of went outside and showed the badges to prove we weren't insane and helped her on the bus. We then overlaid NCP car park data, and we figured out the stores it worked in were the ones that had big car parks outside, and where it didn't, and people had to use public transport or walk a distance, it wasn't working. So great, we knew what was going on. And we wrote a presentation which was always going to kind of work for people in the room who were more interested in data. But I knew there was 2 or 3 stakeholders that was just going to switch off. So the first thing I did was I went and I didn't buy, I borrowed 3 bags of nappies from the staff shop and literally put them on the table. And I said, we'll go through the presentation, but just the key point for those of you that don't like the data is this isn't practical for young mums. That particularly where there's not good access to the car park. And I offered a couple of bottles of 3 bags of nappies into there. Oh, sorry. I'll stop the video just in case that helps. I basically offered to treat somebody who could get the 3 bags of nappies into their car boot without dropping them. I'd already tested because there was revolving doors. I knew they wouldn't go through the revolving doors. So I'd kind of made the point that you couldn't get out of D90 without dropping them. And at that stage, I through the slides, but the 3 people I knew were going to switch off had already kind of got the message, and they remembered the nappies and the swing doors. The guy the 2 or 3 guys who wanted numbers got the numbers afterwards because they just thought, yeah, nice little party piece you've done, but show me the data. But the other part of the audience had kind of got the message without a bunch of data about car parks. So I think you're right. It's really hard when there is that sort of split audience.
That's got to be the absolute definition of a visual story.
Yeah. Yeah, and my team thought it was potty because you've got to try to do what, but it's like for half the audience in that room, it worked better than actually however many charts I showed because the finance team then wanted the charts, but it worked really well as a kind of hook to get people thinking.
Makes a lot of sense. I've certainly done split slides before where you have numeric detail or a high degree of detail available on the slide for those who want to engage with it, but the way I've designed it is that the eye is drawn and it's summarized into points, and the level I'm talking at is for the non-technical stakeholder, because most of the time we'll have a couple of non-technical stakeholders and then some technical stakeholders as well. So certainly covering both as a general seems to be a good default for me. But then I think there's also opportunity to flex that in either direction, depending on the audience as well, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think I've used customer videos in stuff quite a lot before, of kind of showing the chart and then just having almost a picture of the customer in the top, just clicking on it and then having them talk to what was in the slide. So that rather than me kind of explaining the slide in detail, I've had the customer talking about the problem. So the finance, the people who want the slide can kind of look at their leisure at the slide and hope filter out a bit that they're not really listening to the customer, but the people who filter out on the slide are listening to the customer.
Yeah.
Any more thoughts, or is this one done for the agenda?
I was just going to say I did the photos for the local education authority, and they wanted to justify the library service, and they asked me to take photos of children in the library engaging with books. And the penny's only just dropped that when I went to see their presentation, they'd got the children's photos under just a few lines with someone talking over them, and I was drawn to the children enjoying the books in the library that they were trying to sell on the idea of getting them more funding. So I don't even know if that's relevant. It just sort of triggered that thought that this is not new, because we're going back maybe 25 years. So sorry, go on.
And I was going to say, from a data viewpoint, I think we're trying to reinvent a wheel that actually, when we think about it, we kind of know a lot of this.
Yeah. And using people to persuade people is probably better than using pictures and numbers, because people relate to people better than most people relate to people better than they do with numbers and pictures.
Definitely.
There is something nice about a nice graph, but there's an awful lot of graphs that can be distilled down to a bar chart and convey the information you need to show. There's a lot of funky new ways of showing something that actually keep it simple, because it's easier to get the message across, I've found.
Yeah, but the funky stuff is only going to work for someone who's into funky, and if that's your audience, then that's what you've got to do. It's like having a buzzing website with things coming in and out every time you click on something. If someone's looking for a web designer, then they're going to go to that person who's got all these things going. If you just want to find out, what the contact details are of this company, and you've got all these pop-ups flying around, you know your audience.
It's a bit like I've tried to play golf a few times now. I'm atrociously bad, but it strikes me as some of the chart types are a bit like sort of whether you really do need 18 clubs in a bag, or I've done a 9-hole course, and you might as well just give me a kind of some sort of iron, a sand wedge, and a putter, and I can get round. It's the equally as well as I would do with anything else anyway, frankly, or equally badly. But it's like I think you're right, a bar chart, a line chart, and a scatter plot, and you're going to get an awful long way as to you can probably do most of the things you need with 3 charts.
You can get a long way. I was reading something. I really can't remember what it was, but it was how to understand a visualization. I'm like, if you've got to have a blog post on how to understand it, this is already a disaster. I'm never going to use it. I'm not even going to look at the blog. I didn't even look at the blog post, so I can't tell you what it was, because I'm not going to use that. If somebody has to write a blog post to explain something, I can't use that in front of anybody.
Yeah, you're right.
In my experience with the BI professionals, there's a team adjacent to mine that do all of our BI, and actually, one of them's just joined my team. It come from being a lead BI analyst, and you see the change in what they'll deploy as they move up through their progression framework that we have as sort of a BI analyst, is they're learning their craft basically. And one of the things that is a hallmark of like a delivered report at a sort of high level is, like you say, it's using the simpler options. So line, scatter, Gantt bar, density sometimes, but they're very cleverly overlaid and combined together. And you can actually get lots of different combinations that have all sorts of different benefits, but each individual element is immediately understood and recognizable. So it might be that you've got a line chart with a bar chart under it, with a Gantt bar over the top, that's telling you all three different things about something. But when you look at it, you go, oh, well, okay, I can see this is on that axis and this is, and I know what all of these things are, and now I can actually see the interaction with them. And so what you'll tend to see for the experienced, the senior members of the team, is that they'll craft something novel that feels novel and like, oh wow, this is really showing me something. But if you analyze it in the detail, there's not actually anything novel or complex going on. It's just clever use of simple pieces. Same with color and space, like you were saying before. You mentioned, have all the bars one color and one bar the other. We do that all the time. It's not necessarily gray and whatever, but we'll do like blue and well, we've got different palettes depending on what the requirement is, right? But exactly as you're saying, right? And really then the skill is the layout, but then also the person sat behind who's constructing the data and the KPIs such that they are giving you what you need. So that's when I think there's some skill from an analytical perspective to produce things like scores and combinations of KPIs that actually allow you to highlight what you want to show in a simple, easy to explain way. But yeah, feels like we could write a list of things to checklist of things to do when looking at a testing a presentation or testing a piece of BI.
Even a bar chart where you sorted it can make it much more insightful than not.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be complicated.
It's amazing how many people, again, first instinct, particularly sort of younger analysts, gets odd things like that wrong. Because the amount of the ones who I've seen a bar chart and people have sorted things in alphabetical order by brand, so it goes up and down all over the place rather than kind of sort it in order, or sort it at least by region or by something that makes sense as a business. Don't, for God's sake, use alphabetical order. That makes no sense at all. But
I mean, that one's got to be.
Sorry,
Mark. You go.
I was going to say grouping is also kind of, you can group by whatever things, and that just gives context.
Yes.
An average line on a scatter chart can also be quite handy. It's just sort of like, you turn it into quadrants, whatever. It's still lines on a scatter plot. It's not, you're not creating some kind of funky thing. I just looked it up. It was a horizon chart. I don't even know what a horizon chart is. Apparently it's showing you dense time series. I've never had to do that, but if somebody has to explain it, I'm not using it.
Yeah, it's a real test of a visualization. I mean, usually I think it's probably a little bit more, again, audience dependent, and I would say actually research analytics has a much bigger leeway in terms of you can produce a visualization that's using something a bit different as a way to discuss something, but production implemented reporting, you've way less leeway. It's got to be really simple, so there is a scale to this, I think. But yeah, as a manager, I found the junior members of the team that you're saying, okay, we'll go over what you've produced. It's always, why haven't you or why have you decided to use these colors and not just group in terms of positive and negative, or and it's all these little things that feel like you're nagging, and it's sort of like you could say, we're not trying to make something super pretty here, but there's just such real quick wins that through experience you can see that are slightly off. And then for the senior members, it's more along the lines of what is the narrative? Like, what is the sort of philosophical design elements that you've chosen? There's nothing, never really about the little quick wins. It's more about the much deeper, you know, why are we using this metric rather than this one, or why have we given prominence to this insight rather than this? And like that seems to be the difference across seniority.
I think it's a really good point. So we've certainly got style guides, or we did have, and I don't think they get used very much. But the reason they don't get used is that it's what you said about you almost want the checklist guide to kind of have you thought about. Here's 10 things we need you to think about before you press send on that chart. Our style guides tend to be more like, have we followed the brand colours? Have we used the right font? And it's very PR and brand driven. It's like, great, but some of these are fine, we'll use them. And then some of them are, oh God, no, I'm not using that, because you can't seriously put that on a graph and make it work. So they kind of end up in a desk drawer, but the user guide to here's 10 questions I want you to ask before you send your graph out, I think would be a really useful thing.
There's some that are frankly just annoying as an audience member, with the idea of let's say you produce a slide, let's say you produce a Tableau dashboard, right? In Tableau, can I read everything? Great. If I export the image and put it on a PowerPoint and I don't go to the full screen presentation, can I still read it? Great. If it's on a laptop screen, can I read it rather than on the wall? It's like, and if I can't on any of these, too much detail on it, or put it in the appendix, put a simpler version on and say, there's a more detailed bit, you know, or split it across pages. There's just some real simple bits that seem to be really easily missed. And I think you're right. It's that forking of like, I've produced something, now I'm just going to go find the brand standards document and plug everything in to make it. But they're not. The perspective should instead be, what is the digestibility and readability from a stakeholder's perspective? And that's really all that these brand standards and all these other things are trying to get you towards.
See, we had a similar one with the stores dashboard. We did that. They got the first version. We'd done it, the internal BI team, and if you had a large, powerful Mac and Tableau on your screen, it looked gorgeous. It was wonderful. And then I had to kind of get them to say, now go to a store in the back office and open it up on an iPad and see what happens on the store iPad. I was like, oh God, it runs like an absolute dog. It's horrendous. It's like, right, take a load of the complexity out, because that on a kind of iPad in the back of a store is how it's going to be used. So, can't they take it home and use it? No, they can't take it home and do it at home. It's like simplify. Are we story told out on this one? If we are, I'm presuming we've given the ODI up as lost.
Say that again, Martin.
The ODI, they would have been here by now if they were coming, are they?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Right, cool. So does that just leave us with AOB for this one?
Well, we'll I didn't quite catch that again. You'll keep.
Oh, sorry. Does that just leave us with AOB for this one?
Yes. Yeah, the next meeting is on the 9th of June. And I'm hoping to get everyone that should be here today then, and maybe some more. And thank you and welcome to Martin Squires as our chair, which we should have probably done something a bit more grand at the beginning, and he ended up having to introduce himself. That's awful. Sorry, Martin.
No problem.
I'm the new chair.
Yeah. There's at least for the medium term anyway. But yeah, given the gap, I said I was happy to step in and make myself useful.
It's I can see a course coming on, to be honest. But I'll talk about that when you're more susceptible to persuasion.
Yeah, no problem. Well, when I'm more coherent with my internet connection working as well. Right, in that case, if we're done, I think everybody's got a bit of time back, and thank you very much, everybody.
Have a good weekend.
Cheers.
See you.
Thank you very much. See you later.